Welcome. In today's video, we're going to take a look at Microsoft Teams and all the different functions that you can accomplish by using it. This video is going to be kind of a baseline for other videos that deal a lot with business processes within Microsoft Teams, how to leverage it to do different business processes and functions. So this video is kind of that groundwork in order to do those videos. Most of what I've done in my career has been focused on how to use the tools and the technologies that we have available to us to accomplish business processes and how to use them effectively to improve performance or to achieve objectives. And future videos are going to kind of be focused on using Microsoft Teams to its fullest extent. For example, knowledge management is a great business process that Microsoft Teams can help improve, whether it's the continuity planning, the turnover of employees, basically. It can significantly improve that process and getting your employees up to speed quicker when they do transition to newer positions or they move on to different opportunities outside of your organization. So this video is kind of that baseline that we need in order to kind of bridge into those other areas. So let's go ahead and jump right into Teams. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is the perception of Teams. Most people, when they hear Microsoft Teams, the first thing they think of is collaboration. And that's true. Microsoft Teams is definitely a collaborative tool, but it's far more than just a collaboration tool. It's becoming basically the interface that has everything that you need all in one area. It's a very dynamic and very engaging tool. So don't think of it in terms of just the collaboration with other people or other teams. Think about it in terms of your daily workflow because there's a lot built into here, whether it's access to your files and the ability to find your files very easily, or your calendar, or a whole host of different options and opportunities for how you can use Teams both in your day-to-day work plus in the collaboration with other teams or other people. So it's way more than just a collaborative tool. And hopefully this video will kind of lay the groundwork for how you could use this for other things. Now also, my experience has been both on the GCC side. So if you're a GCC employee, my experience is there as well as in the commercial side. So when there's examples of things that don't work in the GCC, I'm going to mention that. Great example is Loop. Loop is not available in the GCC yet, but it's available commercially. So that's an example of a function I'll call attention to throughout the course of this video where you can't do it on the GCC side, but you can do it on the commercial side. All right, so next thing, let's talk about the components of Teams. And specifically what I'm talking about is you have this team interface, right? What else do you get with a team when you have a team set up? The other thing you get is a group. So you essentially get that Microsoft Exchange group that's created, plus an email address for that group. You also get a calendar. You get an entire SharePoint site. If you didn't know it, Teams is kind of like a window. It's a graphical user interface that interacts with SharePoint. So the backend where all your files are stored is SharePoint. And if you use SharePoint lists from your SharePoint backend, you can display those inside your team also. For example, project management. If you decide to use Teams for project management, that SharePoint can provide you all the project tracking, the various list items associated with projects, maybe who it's assigned to. All that information you can pull from a SharePoint list or SharePoint document library and then display within the Teams interface. So it's a very robust tool with a lot of capabilities, especially when you start expanding and including the SharePoint aspects into your team environment. All right, now that we have a good understanding of what Teams is and what its basic design is, let's go ahead and talk about some limits. Now, I might be looking at this and saying, we're talking about Teams, why are we looking at SharePoint limits? Well, because the backend is SharePoint, a lot of your limitations inside of Teams are based on the SharePoint limits. Now, I'm going to put the link for this in the description for the video, so you don't have to worry about trying to figure out what page this is or looking for it. It's going to be right in the description of this video, so feel free to check it out there. Now, I'm not going to cover every limit that's on here. One of the first things we want to take a look at is your file size and file path length. So 250 gigabyte file upload limit, and you've got a 250 megabyte file attachment to a list item limit. Now think of that in terms of a SharePoint list, not a document library. That's what we're talking about when we say about a list item. So it's got a limit of 250 megabytes. One other thing to be aware of is 400 character limit inside of the URL. Now, what are we talking about there? And Windows has a very similar kind of a limitation. Think about nested folders. So you've got your program folder, and then inside your program folder, you've got another folder, and inside of that folder, you've got another folder, and each one of those names is included in the URL that links to that particular file or folder that you're trying to get access to. 400 characters is the limit. And I actually run into this way more often than you might expect because we like to nest our folders, and sometimes the folder lengths are whole sentences long, and you very quickly get to 400 characters when you do that kind of an approach. That's what we're talking about. So if you have SharePoint lists and you have a Teams folder, the more folders that you nest in there, the longer that you're going to get. And you're going to get down to the point where maybe 2 characters can be your file name, and you're already getting an error saying that it's longer than is accepted. That's what this actually translates to, is that file error when there's too many folders and the file names are just too long. Next up, we're going to take a look at the items in the list and the libraries. So the limit is 30 million items. So 30 million documents, 30 million list items per document library or per SharePoint list. Now, when you hit 100,000 items, that's when you're going to start running into problems as far as the permissions and inheritance. And if there's a problem with it and you're already over 100,000, you're actually going to have to remove files just to fix permissions and potentially reset the permissions. These are incredibly important to understand now that we can build Power Apps based on our SharePoint document libraries and our SharePoint lists. So this is kind of that limit to be aware of on when you're going to start running into some problems. So if you're trying to build Power Apps or you're trying to store an entire organization's file structure inside of a single document library or a single SharePoint list, you might want to consider a redesign for that approach. Break things up. For example, teams, you can have a team per organizational level. So maybe your team has one, your group has one, your branch has one, your division has one, whatever your organizational naming structure is, everybody's got their own team option, depending on the limits of how your plan with Microsoft is configured. But essentially, that allows you to break that up. So you can have 30 million files per document library inside your site. So you could have 6 different document libraries inside of your site, and you could have 30 million files in each one of those. Or if you're worried about inheritance or permissions issues, then 100,000 items per. Just make sure you factor that in to your process for how you want to use these different portals within your team. File sync limitations. So when we come down here, there's a limit of 300,000 files for your sync. Now, think about the number of teams that you're synced to. So, for example, you're synced to probably whatever your organizational level is. And if you're in a team, that's essentially where you're storing all of your files so that when you leave or you get promoted, that the next person can kind of get your files and kind of run with them. So all of your files in there, think of how many years that you're with an organization, how many files you've stored up. You can kind of see how this can get into the 30 million files pretty quick over the course of, say, 5 to 10 years, depending on the size of the organizational level. And we're going to talk a little bit about best practices for how to use Teams here in a little while, but that is something to be aware of is 300,000 files when you sync. So the number of places that you sync and the number of files in those locations does matter. All right, that's pretty much it for our limits. Again, check out this page if you've got specific things that you want to look at. All right, now that we're back in here, the next big topic we need to talk about is how do you want to set up your teams? And this is essentially what level do you want to have your teams distributed at? I've seen some places where they go all the way down to the sub-team level, and the sub-team might have like 3 or 4 people in it. And then they go to the team, and the team has maybe 7 or 8 people. And then they go up from there, and it's the group, or it's the branch, or it's a division. Whatever the level that you have, you got to ask yourself, how many employees is that team going to support, and what is the expectation for how they're using it? My recommendation is to always go at the team level, and assuming that the team is around 8 people, that will be my recommendation, is to try to keep it around 8 people to 15 people. That's a good number of people that are being in there. And again, keeping in mind the limits, right? So that's what we're talking about. So the more people that are at that organizational level, the more files that you're going to be storing in there. Because I'm going to do a video in a week or two about continuity planning and turnover. And Teams is a phenomenal tool for knowledge management when it comes to employee turnover. So it's a great approach for kind of building that continuity plan or that turnover plan for your employees. But it doesn't work if you've got too many team members inside of that team, because you are going to hit those limits over time. And you're either purging a lot of files or you're going to do something else to kind of limit the number of files in there. plus not to mention just the sheer size that it will grow to over time. So you got to be kind of cautious about how you set this up. You don't necessarily want to have every sub-organization in the organization to have its own team, but maybe you do. That's the question that you have to kind of assess for your area. Again, my recommendation is your lowest level that is typically around the team size, so not necessarily a sub team, but a team. And then each organization after that should probably have one as well. So you're kind of thinking of how's your intranet work? And this might be what's ringing to a lot of people's minds is, hey, it sounds a lot like an intranet. Yeah, in a lot of ways it kind of is. But think of teams, or at least depending on how you decide to structure this, think of it as kind of like the organizational intranet for your continuity plan. Now, not every organizational level is going to have a really robust build out of files. For example, a team, you might have a lot because everybody's in there, all their files in there, all their functional areas, all their programs might be in there potentially. So the files are going to be different when you start moving up the organization. You want to keep the focus of each organizational level. What does that organizational level need? So let's talk in terms of like a department. So that's usually a pretty good size chunk of the organization. It might have literally hundreds of teams. Maybe it has some divisions. Maybe it has some branches. It's got different elements in it. At that level, what does the entire department need in terms of a team? Probably not much. You might be talking templates, or you might be talking about reporting processes for reporting safety issues, or reporting some sort of a mechanical issue, or some sort of a facility issue, or managing contracts at the department level. So the types of information and what's available on that team varies drastically the higher the organizational level you go up. And that's how you should really try to structure these is essentially you've got a team for each of your organizational levels. Now, this is all one approach. There's also another line of thinking where you essentially have a team at a certain organizational threshold. And maybe it's the division, or maybe it's the branch. Maybe it's the second or third level down the organizational chain that you've set this thing up essentially. And then you have channels for each organization under that. Now, this can work. It's a very effective approach as well as just having your teams. The problem is that you end up with a whole bunch of hidden channels a lot of times. And when you click on this button here, I've only got one, which is the general hidden, but there might be 25 or 30 because they might just be a whole bunch of different private channels, or they're just hidden. And maybe you've got access to a whole bunch of these different organizational levels. So it gets kind of messy when you're at the very bottom of that structure to find what you're looking for, because you can reorganize your teams. You can't reorganize your channels, at least not yet. Maybe that's something that they're going to work on in the future. And when you think of how that's set up, it's actually very similar to the old SharePoint approach where you had the ability to create subsites. Now, you might be saying, well, that worked really well. Yeah, but how you viewed everything inside of that structure was very different from how Teams functions. This interface here gets very long very quickly when you have a whole bunch of teams with 50 different channels built into it. So just kind of think of the different ways you might want to structure this. Now, maybe you have a hybrid approach where you have teams for certain levels and then you have channels for everything that's under a certain level. So you can kind of play around with the design methodology. My recommendation though is that you try to use teams a lot of times for your organizational levels, and then your team channels underneath of that are specific to that team. Maybe it's projects they're working on, maybe it's functional areas they're in charge of, and you can kind of structure your channels to kind of work within that team construct. But either approach can work. My recommendation though is to go the team route. I've seen that be a little bit more effective than the channels. Channels are just a little bit harder to work with from the usability standpoint. Now, one other thing let's talk about quick. As you saw here, I've got a hidden channel. This is a new function. This is a new feature that they've added, and it does work in both the GCC and the commercial side. You can hide the general channel now. For a long time, people were like, what is the general channel? Because every single team's default includes a general channel. And nobody knew what to do with that, especially people that haven't really used Teams and they're just kind of getting familiar with it. Everybody's like, what is the general? Like, what does that mean? What's supposed to be there? And it caused a lot of confusion. And it's to the point where a lot of people just didn't like Teams because they didn't understand it, because you couldn't rename the general channel either. Now, I don't know why they went with the approach of hiding it. versus just giving us the ability to change the name, because essentially what the community has been asking for is the ability to change the name, because that would just make sense. But all we can do right now is hide it. And when you hide the channel, yes, it is hidden. Yes, you can still access it as a hidden channel. You can't delete it. It's permanent. It's stuck there. When you go to the SharePoint side, you can still see the general channel, all the files and folders that are there or potentially could be there, and you can still interact with it. So again, it still continues to cause some confusion with what do you do with this general channel. Hopefully they'll just give us the ability to someday change the name, because that's really all we're looking for, is the ability to change the name. But so far Microsoft has been resistant or unable to allow us to change the name of this file folder, at least not in any easy way. There might be a way through PowerShell to adjust this, but a lot of organizations put a lot of restrictions on using PowerShell just because of the potential security threats. But as you can see here, you have the ability to hide it, but not delete it, and you can't rename it. But what you can do is create a new one, hide this one, and then you can rename this as many times as you want after it's been built. So you can actually kind of play around with the structure to see what works best and what naming conventions work, because names do matter. It does help people with their jobs if they understand the names and they can kind of intuitively figure out where they're supposed to go. So I called this one a team space. But that is a new function that was recently added, so good to cover that on this particular video. Now, one other thing before we start talking about everything else that we've got in here, and I'm not going to cover all of these in depth. Each one of these different things could be its own video all on its own. But let's talk about shared folders and Teams folders. Now, most organizations, because a lot of this stuff, whether it's Teams or some of the other tools that are out there, we've all had shared folders, some sort of network attached storage or some sort of a network storage solution. We've been using that for decades, and that's where you go to store all of your files. Now, things have gotten a little confusing because we've got a lot of different cloud options, whether it's your standalone SharePoint site or your team portal, or you've got your network attached storage. Where do employees go to find their files? Do they go to Teams? Because you have the file option right here and they can click on it and they can see all the files. Do they go to the shared drive? Do they go to SharePoint? And again, we've learned now that this is SharePoint also on the back end. So essentially you've got your standard SharePoint. Maybe you have an organizationally visible SharePoint. That's how I typically set it up, is you have Teams as kind of your internal work documents, and you've got your SharePoint, which everybody across the entire organization can see, type documents and different things inside of there. But that's another thing to consider, is what are you setting up? I recommend people get away from shared drives. What I typically do with the shared drive is it becomes kind of a backup. Now, keep in mind that version history is turned on, and typically there's about 500 of each file that's retained. So you've got essentially your backups here, but it doesn't hurt to have another backup in a shared drive. So what I typically do as a setup is I'll use the shared drive that's there as the backup, and it'll just kind of convert into a backup process. And then you've got your cloud storage here in Teams, which is your personal files and all your team files and that kind of stuff. And then you've got your SharePoint, which is even further limited, because then you're talking about what does the entire organization need to know about? What does the entire organization need to be able to see? And that's kind of the recommendation I have for how you kind of set these things up. So you've got essentially each has its specific purpose, whether it's the network attack storage or that shared folder. That is essentially your backup, your kind of backup in case something happens and you can't access the cloud files. And then you get your Teams for working. So that's one thing to consider too, is where are your employees going to? How many different places do they have to go to find files? And trying to make it a little bit easier for them to kind of centrally locate and figure out, okay, I'm working on my stuff or my team stuff. Let's go into Teams and work on that. And then if it's for everybody else, hey, maybe it's the financials and I got to make sure that the entire organization can see these financial documents. That's where I would go to SharePoint and put that in there. All right, so let's take a look at our Teams interface here. So we have the posts, and I don't have any posts in here, but this is really where a lot of different things are going to be posted into it. So for example, this is your conversation or your chat. Maybe you're talking to your team, hey, don't forget we have Wednesday off, or hey, don't forget we have Friday off, or hey, maybe we got a company picnic coming up, don't forget to bring your dish to pass, or whatever that is. That's essentially what you could use this for, is having those kinds of discussions. Now, that's at an organizational construct. What about a community of practice? So you can use teams and community practices and programs and that kind of stuff. And in the terms of like a Power BI or Power App community of practice or community of purpose that you put into place, this could be a, hey, how do you do this? Hey, I've had this problem. I'm getting this error. Has anybody else had this error? And you can turn it into kind of a group chat in that regard. You could also post, hey, we're going to do training on X, Y, and Z. And you basically give permissions to this team, to people that are interested in learning that or doing the same kind of functions within your organization. So that's a great use case for how you would use posts and how to leverage those inside of your organization. And then you've got your files, which you already talked a little bit about this. One or two very important key facts here is the sync button. So most of us, especially if you're in the age demographic of 30 and above, have used Windows Explorer, and we're very familiar with how to use Windows Explorer. Well, the sync button here essentially syncs this folder to our computer so we can interact with the files right there on our computer. So let me go ahead and click this button here. And you're going to see up here, it's trying to open up OneDrive. Now this does leverage OneDrive for this, so we'll go ahead and hit the open here. And we're going to get notified that it is syncing our files. So what does that look like? Now this is essentially Office Solutions Pro. That was the team space that we created, and that's the channel right there. And here are all the files and folders. So very familiar layout. This is what the Windows Explorer looks like. And all you have to do is come down here and you can see whatever your organizational structure is named. You're going to see that there. And it's going to list all of the different files and folders that are in there. And you'll see this little cloud icon, which means that it's available in the cloud. It hasn't been synced to our computer yet. In order for it to sync to our computer, we just have to open it up, and then you're going to see a little check mark that says it's available for you to actually access on your computer. So this is a great way to access your files. And the benefit of using this approach is that when you open up the files, it's going to open it up in the desktop version of the program. So when you open up a Word document in here, it's going to open up in the Word program versus using the web capable version, which is a little bit more limited on what you can do. The other benefit is that you can still collaborate. So if multiple people can be in here working on the same file, and you can have discussions and you can see what people are working on, and you can kind of work together to get files done. This is a great way to still interact with a view that most of us are familiar with without having to use the web version of the apps, which is a little bit limited in some cases like Excel and Word. Even PowerPoint has some limitations on what you can do. So this gives you the option to kind of work within a space that you're more familiar with while also still using the Teams construct for everything. Now, one of the other things you can do from this interface that isn't available in most of the other areas is if you click these three dots over here, you can open it in SharePoint. So let's go ahead and actually see what this looks like in SharePoint. All right, so this is the SharePoint view, and you can see, again, all of our folders are right here. We're inside of the TeamSpace channel. If we click over here, we're going to see the general. Again, remember I said that it doesn't get hidden here, even though it probably should. And then we can see our TeamSpace documents here. And then you have the actual SharePoint portal. So again, we're on SharePoint. So we can go to the home screen and we can actually redesign all this. Now, I haven't done any redesign on this. This is just kind of the basic stuff that's available when you create a new team. But you can leverage this and you go to site contents and you can start creating different lists and document libraries, and you can do all kinds of things that you can do on SharePoint while still working within the team's environment, because everything that you build here is also going to be accessible within your team by just adding it as a link. So it's a great option to have to use the SharePoint aspect as well. Now you can also just develop this thing off, and people that don't like using Teams, they can still do a lot of the same functionality from here that they could do in the team. Although the team, when I start going through the rest of the functions, really does have a lot more that you can do. All right, the other thing you've got up here is the OneNote capability. So you've got OneNote built in. Every team comes standard with OneNote. Now, I don't have anything in here. It's going to kind of set it up for us for the first time. But what I'm going to show you in the future is how you can leverage this for turnover and continuity planning. It's a great resource for doing that. And again, it's built right into the team. So it centrally locates all the aspects that I'm going to talk about right here in this one interface. Now you can also come up here and add other things. So we can add a channel calendar. Let's go ahead and do that. So we'll add that channel calendar, and we're just going to call it a team calendar and hit save. And then you'll see that we have our ability to add events to our calendar. Now we'll go ahead and select an item here. And again, very similar to, say, Microsoft Outlook. The one thing you're going to have that's a little bit different is this here. Now, if you delete this, it's going to add it to your personal calendar. I don't know why Microsoft built this way. You're working within the team. It should always just add it to the team. But it's probably better to think of the team as kind of like a container, and then the channels are actually what you work within. So in that regard, I guess it does kind of make sense that once you delete the channel, which is essentially the team space here, it would go back to your personal calendar, just because that team really just is kind of the container for all the different channels, which the channel is kind of the team. It's just kind of an interesting way to look at it. But anyway, when we create these things, you have the ability to send the personal invites. Now, there is a known issue with how this works. If you don't check this and it sends an email to everybody, then you might need to reach out to Microsoft so they can correct it on their end. That's what we had to do in one of our organizations, was had to reach out to Microsoft, and then they were able to fix it so that it only send them a notification when they check this box here. So just be aware of that potential issue. If you do run into that, it is solvable. There is a fix for that, but you might run into that problem. One of the great things about this approach is the scheduling assistant is right here. I tend to think it's a little bit better than the scheduling assistant that Outlook has. And again, it's easier to access and use when you're building this. The other thing is that when you create this thing, you've got all these options up here. Now, a lot of these are kind of the same thing, but you can have a registration requirement, which you can't necessarily do inside of an Outlook calendar. So you can build that here. Let's go ahead and close out of here for now, and we'll discard. So one other thing I wanted to kind of leverage here and show you is going to be, if we click see all here, you've also got the option to add the file browser, so you can actually put specific files in there. And great example of this is maybe you've got some sort of a weekly or monthly update that you need to do. You can make Teams more effective for people by just putting the tools that they use on a regular basis right here. Whether that's a Word doc or an Excel file, put it right here so they don't have to go anywhere else. They don't have to go search for some file every single week to go update it. Just put it right there, and then they can update it right in here. You can also add websites, and you can actually put Power Apps in here, and you can put Power BI reports in here. So you've got a lot of different capabilities. Maybe there's a survey request form or some other form that you have to put in for requests for communication support, or whatever the different processes that you've got inside your organization. You can integrate all that right into this Teams interface over here. Now, it can get kind of busy, so you want to make sure that you kind of focus on what does your team actually need to have in there. I saw one example where they put a FAQ in there, and everybody just went there and they could do a search of the FAQ to find whatever question that they're trying to figure out. That's a great idea for how to put something useful in here that makes this team more useful for the user. All right, so now we're pretty much done with this aspect. Now we're going to start moving up and down this side. Like I said, there's a lot inside of Teams. So let's go ahead and break into some of these other things. So now we've got the activity area. Now, one of the recent changes that annoys a lot of people is every time they get a email that has a calendar invite, now they're getting notified of all these calendar invites coming through email. You can turn that off. So if we come up here and we hit the notification settings, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see calendar. And again, you can show this in activity, or you can choose not to show these things inside of the activity. I tend to think that the Outlook is its own little thing. We still can't necessarily access our emails from Teams. So maybe we don't necessarily need to put this in here. So I think that calendar invites probably shouldn't be activity updates, but that's just kind of mine. But you can also turn off some of these other areas up here if you don't like getting all these other notifications. I would advise to be kind of cautious about removing everything, because there are some things that are beneficial. A lot of times I use the activity area for missed phone calls. So that it'll usually show that somebody called me. I definitely wouldn't turn that one off, because that's a great option to be able to see who called. Then you've got your chat here. And if you come in here, you can actually change these. So if you wanted to change the name of this, you can change that by clicking here. And so, for example, maybe you've got like your team chat, or you've got your company chat, or whatever your chat group happens to be. Maybe it's a project or functional area. And then you can also change the image here by selecting this. And you can also upload. So if you've got kind of like a company logo or brand or something like that, you can also upload as well. And that can make it a lot easier to find what chat you're looking for in all these different chats. You can also search up here. Now, inside of the chat, when you share files or share different pictures and that kind of stuff, you can see all that information by clicking on the File tab here. And then down here, you've got a ton of options. Now, in the case of the GCC, you don't have the loop yet. That's not an option in the GCC. And Praise is new, so that's a new option if you aren't aware of it. This is a great tool for letting employees know they did a good job. Maybe you're a team manager, a group manager, branch manager, division manager, something like that, and you want to call attention to an employee that knocked it out of the park. Maybe they did a good job on something. You can use this praise option within the team posts and actually post a praise for that employee. Or maybe you're an employee and you'd had a really good experience working with John over in some other department. You could also use this in that regard. And it's a great way for employees to recognize each other or for management to recognize their employees. Again, I think a lot of employers are a little deficient on the recognition of their employees. So this is just another tool in the toolbox for how you can call out great employees. We can't always give them raises. We can't always give them bonuses. It's not too hard to give them a little praise inside of a Teams app. Just saying. And then you've got some other options over here. Now, GCC doesn't have approvals. Approvals are kind of like your workflow. We'll talk about that here in a second. Well, actually, we may as well just go there. So there's this approvals tab here. I look at this as kind of like workflows. If you remember the older versions of SharePoint before they started switching over to Power Apps and getting away from InfoPath, workflows are very similar to approvals. Now, you can replicate this within the Power Automate, but this is a much easier approach for approvals that are just simple approvals. It's not too complicated. You're just sending X, Y, or Z, or you're just, maybe a leave request. You can put all that kind of stuff into here. Adobe Sign and DocuSign are paid subscriptions, so you have to actually work with Adobe and DocuSign and have contracts with them to use those functionalities. But you can just use the standard approvals out of the box. Again, this isn't available on the GCC side. At least most organizations have this disabled or don't have it as an option. Then you've also got shifts. Again, this is another one of those things you're not going to see in the GCC, but let's go ahead and refresh this. It's a very interesting tool. It allows for essentially creating that shift plan for your employees. And we'll go ahead and kind of walk through this. I'm not going to go through too in depth on this because this could be a standalone video all on its own is how this works. But you can see it's basically, think back in the old days, if you ever worked at like a restaurant or something like that, where you had the paper schedule, this kind of replaces that. So this works great for small businesses that don't necessarily have the robust paid programs for how they manage their shifts. This could work great for that experience. All right, then we've got Planner. Now, Planner can be either linked to a group or team, or it can be just kind of standalone. And Planner is a phenomenal, amazing tool. Can't say enough good things about Planner. I use it all the time. I don't have anything in here to kind of show and highlight how great this is. Again, this could be its own standalone video. I will tell you that Microsoft Planner is going through a refresh. They're integrating all of Project for the Web into this. So the capability is going to get significantly enhanced on what you can do inside of Planner in the coming year. Some of it's already available and people are already out there testing it and doing reviews on it and that kind of stuff. You're not really going to see a lot of the functionality until later this year and into next year. I'll be doing a standalone video specifically on Planner when we get to that point. So I'll actually have a plan kind of filled out and an example of all the different things you can do in Planner when we do that. For now, let's go ahead and move on to the calendar. Now in the calendar, this is your calendar. So this is essentially what you would see inside of Microsoft Outlook as your calendar. Again, a lot of different things from tools that you typically interact with, whether it's Outlook, the calendar, or some of the other things that are coming up here in a few seconds. Now from in here, you can create new meetings right by clicking this, and then you've got that scheduling right there. So I can find this to be very convenient over trying to do it in Outlook because I can kind of see everything right here based off my schedule, and then I can use the new meeting to kind of schedule it with other people and see what's going on with their schedules. And then you can also just hit the meet now, and then you'll go live on a meeting, and then you can add people at that time, or you could join by an ID if you have the ID information. A lot of times this is helpful when you're talking about conference room usage of Teams, is you would join with an ID. And then we've got down here the call area. Now, in terms of the call area, I use this quite a bit to kind of see missed calls. But it is kind of helpful if you want to see how long you were talking to somebody or the amount of time you spent on a phone call with somebody. A lot of times when you're talking about billable hours, for example, how long did you talk to somebody when you're a lawyer or you're in some sort of a professional capacity where you bill by essentially the hour or half hour? And this can give you kind of that summary of how much time was actually spent talking with the client. if you need to have that information. So this can be a great resource depending on your situation or your business case for using it. And then we've got OneDrive. Now, again, this is all your files. This is everything that you would normally go to your My Documents area, all within this one easy to use interface. And you don't necessarily need to open it in here. You still have the option to open it in the desktop from here, but it's an awesome search tool, much better than how Windows Explorer is set up for search. It's much more effective, and you can also do sorts, and it'll show you all of your recent documents. So maybe you're looking for something you know you just recently opened. It's going to have all that information right here, easy to access. You'll also have the ability to access all of the team files, so you can come down here and actually access everything here. If you worked on a file with somebody, you have the option to look at that as well. So again, you've got a ton of options to include the ability to favorite files you go to on a regular basis or very frequently. Now, most of the time they're going to be in your recent, but you can also sort by specific types. Now, I haven't opened up any Word. I have opened up an Excel, so I can actually go through here and see what I've opened up and filter it down to those specific programs. Now, the other thing you've got is the ability to add other apps. So you've got a whole host of different apps you can add right here. For example, you could have the Power Apps. And if you want to do Power Apps Teams development, you can do that in here, Power BI. You have a ton of different things that you can add inside here. A lot of times by default, your planner might not be there or your Power BI might not be there. Maybe you have a requirement to do a bunch of forms. You can add all of those right here. That way you have one-stop shop for everything that you need to work on right from this one interface. Again, it's a little bit more than just your collaborative tool. Teams is actually expanded to be a kind of your personal one-stop shop for everything you need to work on right here. All right, let's go back to the team interface for one more quick update here. So in the files area, one of the other things you can do is something that's frequently missed, frequently not used. If you come here, you can click the new button and you can create all of these documents right here. You don't have to go into a Windows Explorer. You don't have to go in down here and say new file. You can come up right here. Now, one of the things that people never do, a lot of people are aware of this, but you can create your own template. So for example, your organization might have its own template file. Maybe it's a Word doc, maybe it's a PowerPoint, and you have a specific PowerPoint design. You can put all those templates right here, and all of your employees have access to these templates right here. They don't have to go to try to find, hey, what's the template document we're supposed to use for this type of document? Or, hey, what's the type of file format we're supposed to have for this? You can put all that information right here, easy to access, and you can also reorganize, and you can kind of get rid of all these blank ones and just put your organizational branded documents right here for people to use. That is a fantastic way to kind of put that standardization within your organization. All right, that's pretty much it for today's video. Hope you found the content helpful. And remember, I'm going to be doing videos on how to do continuity planning or kind of that turnover. And I'll actually build out the team construct so that I'll have a lot of information in there to kind of demonstrate what that looks like and also the comparison to what it used to be and how you can kind of leverage that knowledge management aspects of teams in your organization. Until next time.